So I tried to strike a balance between nobody knows anything about unit testing and you know everything about unit testing, because based on some of the comments that were coming up in the meetup and whatnot, it seemed like there was kind of a mix. And so anyway, like I said, I tried to strike that balance between them. So we've got about 27 slides. It won't take very long. If you're bored, I apologize. It'll get more interesting in the live coding. If you're stuck on anything I say, then pause and we'll go from there. So anyway, I knew that wasn't going to work. We'll just do that. Okay, so why should you test your application? Now, this has nothing to do with Ember. This is any application. You can apply this equally. Of course, obviously, the focus of our presentation is Ember. So why should you be interested in doing any sort of code testing? There's a ton of reasons. I just picked kind of those highlights we can talk about. Better designed code. So the idea behind testing of your code is you want to be able to execute very discrete pieces of functionality that do just one thing, and that we could test it in isolation and know that that component, that building block is solid. And then you do that over and over and over, and then you start putting those pieces together. So if you have a strong foundation, you've got a strong structure. So keeping that in mind, like that's how you should be testing your code, well, then that means you need to write your code that way as well. You're not going to have a single function that's 250 lines long and does 10 things and reaches out to global scope and modifies stuff and whatnot. You're not going to have 22 code paths through it and switch statements that return and then sometimes create an anonymous function that dynamically generates something off of a variable name. And you know the kind of code I'm talking about. So writing tests forces you to write better designed code because of how you need to be able to test your code. And you'll see that as we start talking more. You can prove your code actually works. You don't actually have to go and stand up a full application using all of your code, or have to show to a manager and say, look, if I actually do this and you can click here, if you can run your unit test suite, or your test suite rather, and it passes, then you have proven that your code works. You've proven it to yourself, you've proven it to your coworkers, you've proven it to your manager, you've proven it to anybody else. It's a form of sample code. So, yes, ma'am?
But is that really true? Because in some of the test cases, you tell it what the answer should be. So if you tell it the wrong answer, and your code produces that wrong answer,
yeah,
you're
right. But that's still perfectly fine.
Correct.
Because if I tell it that, if I give it the wrong inputs and I expect the wrong answer, if it still does that, then that's correct. If it's doing math, and I give it 3 and a 2, and it adds, and I get back a 7, then you know something's wrong. But if it's something that just says, hey, put these two strings together, and you know you normally are passing in a first name and a last name, but now you're passing in 2 colors, and you get back a color, that's perfectly fine. It still did what it's supposed to do. It had nothing to do, you take away the context in which it's going to be used, and you're testing just the code logic itself. And we'll come back to that. You'll see it when we're writing the actual test. It'll make more sense, I promise.
But to your bigger point, I mean, if you write bad tests, then yeah, it's not going to do much for you. You have to be able to write.
That is true. It is code testing code, and if you don't know how to write code, yeah, I mean, you're right. That is a good point. It's a form of sample code. So if you're brand new to a project, well, that's pretty much it. If you're brand new to a project, open source, you're at work or whatever, and you're curious how something works, I do this all the time. I know Matt does too for Ember. Not so much now because we've read so much of the source code, we got a pretty good handle on it. But you're like, what the heck? First time you're learning initializers, you're like, I have no idea the magic that's going on here. You start reading the source code, you're like, I still don't understand it. There's this K letter all over the place. What is going on? You go grab the unit test, and you're like, oh, look at that. They're testing 5 things. It's got a pretty small surface area, and here's what it's doing. Oh, now I get it because I'm passing this in. This is what they're expecting to come back. This one gives me back a container. Okay, now I'm kind of, got a pretty good handle on it. So it's not your only form of documentation. I'm not recommending that you only have unit tests, and there's no documentation for your code. But in and of itself, unit tests form a good sample usage of your code base. Low-level regression test suite. So this allows you easily, especially if you're on a team, Matt makes some changes, his code's running just fine. He can then run the full test suite and see if he broke anything else that's going on before it gets checked into your code. Now obviously, you're checking it into some sort of feature branch, it's going through a code review and automated, there's a whole slew of things. But if it's really easy, if you just run the test, pass-fail, you automatically know if something broke without, further down the line and then having to come back. Especially if you make it to like the QA or any of those external teams, because now you've got that turnaround time and the cycle and all that kind of stuff. And then refactoring is very easy. So if you have well-tested code, which means you have well-designed code, your need to refactor will be limited. Does not mean you're not going to have to do it, but it's not going to happen as often, especially if you've started with tests, so we'll get into that. But when you do need to refactor, it makes it much easier, because now you can go make a change to a function and method, whatever, run the test, and you know whether or not it broke something. You know whether or not it broke what you thought it would break, and you also know whether or not it broke something you have no idea would be affected by it. And if that does happen, you've got two great things that have happened. One, it caught it before it became an actual issue, and two, you've identified a part of your code that probably isn't as well designed as it should be, because it now has, its scope of influence has exceeded your expectation of what it should be doing. You did not expect this code over here in the corner to be impacted by this change. So something is talking to a global scope, or it's not passing references around correctly, or something along those lines, because you expected isolation, and the results of your tests were that you didn't have that. All right,
Can
so
I also say that about that regression testing too?
yeah, I mean, they kind of all go hand in hand. Sure. So ways that you can achieve what we just talked about then. So there's different types of tests. So within the scope of what we're going to talk about tonight with Ember, we're going to talk about unit, functional, and integration/acceptance. There's a lot more types of tests. I go out to Wikipedia, there's like 25 different types. It depends on different programming paradigms, it depends on different organizations, et cetera, et cetera. These are the ones we're focused on tonight: unit, functional, and integration/acceptance. And I'll explain why that's written that way in just a moment. All right, so a unit test. It's going to test discrete blocks of code and functionality within individual components. So, using literally this image as our example, we have a single Lego block. I don't care what shape it is, but in this particular case, all these dimensions that are on here, we're testing that that block is exactly to these specifications. It does one thing, it does exactly what it's supposed to do. Based off of input, I get the expected output. And then I can have another one that's designed a different way, and it has its own set of unit tests. But again, it's discrete blocks of code. This cannot simultaneously be two different blocks, right? It has to be one or another. So you're going to have a function that just does some string replacement, or you can have a method that will attach some observers, or you have a method that concatenates first and last name. You're not going to have one method that says, do the stuff, and then it puts all of those things in there. That's not well-designed code. That's not testable code. So unit testing, again, is testing those discrete blocks of functionality. And we have examples of all of this in case that's not making sense.
So what do you do with something like ice, that based on the temperature, it's water? And even a hotter temperature, it's steam. And even hotter, maybe it's vaporized and gone.
That would be perfectly fine. It does not apply to my literal example of this block can't be more than one thing at a time. But you certainly could have let's say you have I guess basically we call it a water class. And it could have a method called getState. And that getState will return, let's say a text string, steam, water, ice, whatever, based off of some other condition. So when you're testing your unit test, you're going to have, in that case, let's say you have 3 unit tests. One's going to say that expect it to say water when it's below, above 32 degrees. Another one that says I expect it to have ice as my answer when it's below 32 degrees, and I expect steam to be my answer when it's above 200 degrees. So then when I'm setting up my unit test, I'm going to take my object and I'm going to set my temperature. So I'm going to set temperature 30. Well, now I'm expecting that my result out of getState is going to be whatever. And so that's how I test that. So it's possible for a method to have multiple outputs, but you need to test all of those individual discrete states of that output. No pun intended with the state thing. Or no confusion intended. All right, so a functional test is then going to ignore the internal parts of the code and focus on the output. So we had those individual blocks, right? So let's say we were previously describing a door. So how can we unit test a door? It has the ability, it has an open and a closed state. It has a locked state. Does it have a window? Like all these things, right, that can describe this door class. It's classic OOP type of design. So that's your unit test. Well, having something have a lock state and something having an open or a closed state, I need a functional test. Can I be locked and be open? What happens if I don't have a lock but I'm closed? Those types of things. How do I function? This test has my individual parameters and properties. This tests my functionality as a whole of the unit. So sticking with our Lego example, we have individual blocks. We can then build a door. Now we can test the functionality of that door. So those are functional tests. And the next part is integration acceptance test. So this tests your flow within the entire application. It's going to emulate user interaction and confirm expected results. So we went from those individual blocks to we built some doors, took some other blocks, built some windows, etc. to now we build ourselves a castle or our application. And now how are the users going to expect it? We have guests come in, whatever. You would go forever on the analogies. But the idea is that integration and acceptance testing is going to emulate user interaction and confirm expected results. Now the reason why I wrote both there with a slash is because if you go read Ember, the Ember docs, versus the ember-cli docs. Ember-cli talks about acceptance tests, and Ember talks about integration tests. They're talking about the same thing, but they use two different terms to talk about them. And I haven't hunted down why there's that disparity between the terms, but they mean the same thing as far as like what you're actually testing within your Ember application.
Acceptance testing is more driven toward meeting requirements, like business goals.
I agree from an application standpoint.
Flows.
If I'm testing a route, I would completely agree. By definition, you're absolutely right. And I think that's where ember-cli is going with it because it's supposed to be more of a larger ecosystem.
Yeah.
So, yeah, correct. Within all of these, you can have unit, functional, and acceptance. And then as soon as you take your application and put it into a larger ecosystem, that itself can be unit tested because, again, you can start putting these layers on top of each other and all that kind of stuff. So anyways, that's why I put both words, because if you're reading Ember.js testing docs versus the Ember-cli information about testing, they use two different words to mean the exact same thing. Even though, correct, they can actually have different meanings. Ember is using two words that mean the same thing at the moment. All right, so any questions about that? And we will get into examples of this. Because it also gets very murky when you start talking about components, because they kind of cross the worlds between these words. Yes, sir?
Are some of those types of testing emphasized more than others in the Ember community? Like, for example, in like the Rails world, generally you just care about like unit integration. My controller tests are just really simple and done. So I don't know, like, how it is.
Yeah, it's I guess it depends on what you're doing. So same thing with like in Ember. Controller tests can be really simple and done also. If you are, you probably want to test your computer properties. You already help sort of like helper methods, that kind of stuff. But they're just, yeah, you're in and out. They're really easy. They focus a little bit more, I guess, at that point on integration acceptance testing, where they want you to go to a route, and see when I went there, these things were rendered. But it comes down to what your application is actually doing. And again, and we will touch on this more. Components are weird. They fit in both worlds simultaneously. So you're doing unit testing and this, and we had a very long conversation about this afternoon. I'll touch on it briefly tonight, just to get other people's opinions and share with you where our position is on it. Like, where do you draw that line between what you're testing? Your gut feeling is like, oh, I've got an answer, until we start pointing out the things that I was pointing out this afternoon, and everybody goes, oh, you suck, go away. And I'm like, but no, we need to address this. And they're like, I don't want to. So you don't want your test suite and the writing of tests to be a burden, or you're never going to write them. But if they're so simple in what it is that they're testing, then what's the point in having them? Like, there's that balance between, what am I getting out of them versus what's it taking to create them. All right. So within those types of tests we're going to run, unit, functional, and integration or acceptance testing, there are some styles of tests. And again, there's other styles. We're just going to talk about these two. And again, these are those slides that kind of just get you, generally introduced to the concepts. So there's TDD and BDD. So TDD is test-driven development, and BDD is behavior-driven development. And those are two of the more common paradigms and approaches to your styles of testing. All right, so TDD is your test-driven development. So we've already talked about the unit testing, complete isolation. What's my state? Am I water, am I steam, am I ice? So you're just going to do that over and over and over. That's what TDD is. You're going to write the test, you're going to run the test suite, you're going to see that the test failed, you're going to go write code until that test passes. Then you're going to describe additional functionality in your unit test. The test is going to fail, you're going to write code until that passes, and you go on and on and on and on. Test-driven development is because you write the tests first, and then you write the code to make the test pass. The syntax style is assertions. So you'll have words, depending on the library you're using, you're going to have words like equal and okay, not okay, is true. It's very assertive. This is going to be okay. This is going to be equal to this. So it's very much a programmer's type of syntax. It's very close to the logic and to the code. And again, this is true for any, this doesn't have to just be Ember. We're going to get into the Ember specific stuff. This is just kind of a general background. The other one is BDD, behavioral-driven development. So instead, tests are going to reflect the behavior desired by the stakeholders. So you can still do TDD with BDD styling. You just don't do it quite as rigorously, I guess. Like it's kind of hard to describe. It's better later. They use expectations. So you expect this thing to be a string, or you expect foo to have a property bar with a length of 3. It's very user-oriented, user stories. If you have any project management teams, or even QA, you have actors and roles and users and that type of stuff, and you're defining user expectation and user actions. This is the type of syntax that they're using. These are the types of words that they're using. Something we eventually want to get to, but we're several code iterations away from this, is I would like for our project managers, when they're coming up with the user stories, to describe the user stories in BDD, and then from that, QE will generate their user tests, acceptance tests, and we will generate our unit tests, functional tests out of it, because it's all using the BDD language and the BDD syntax. So if at the end of the day, your code is supposed to have acceptance testing to meet the criteria of expected behavior, then we could have the stakeholders actually define that for us. We generate the test automatically, and then we write our code to pass these tests. And you're not going to have 100%, one-to-one mapping there, but you can get awfully darn close. So you accomplish the same thing. It's just, are you approaching it purely from like kind of a coder's mentality, or are you approaching it more from a, someone who's going to be consuming it? At the end of the day, you're getting the same results. I personally prefer BDD syntax, but that's just me. And then it gets really interesting here in a few slides because you can mix and match all this stuff together. So here you go. Which style when? All right, so your unit tests are predominantly going to use TDD. This is where you're going to see that used the most. I expect to call this method and it's going to return me this. If I pass this in, this is going to be equal to that. Very much code level, that kind of logic expectation. Doesn't mean you can't mix and match them, but that's predominantly where you're going to see TDDs in unit tests. BDD is more likely to be found in your functional integration and acceptance tests. TDD can be used out there as well. We actually do all TDD at the moment in all of those layers. So again, it can be mixed and matched. So there's libraries to help with all of this. So QUnit is the default testing framework for Ember.js. And as such, it's also the default used by ember-cli. So it is a TDD testing framework, which is why right now we use TDD for our unit, functional, and our acceptance/integration tests. And because it's the default testing framework and ember-cli has stuff set up, it just automatically works for you. Like, here you go. If you want it, and you're going to see it. If you want to start writing an Ember application and do a unit test, if you use QUnit, you're off to the races. It's already there. It just works. You don't have to use QUnit. Mocha is another library that's very popular. It has TDD support. It also has BDD support. It can also give you the QUnit styles via interface classes inside of it, so that way you can use Mocha but still feel like you're using QUnit as you're making the transitory progress between them. This is and I mentioned this earlier, this is an add-on that just came out last week that will give you Mocha support inside of your Ember application in place of QUnit support. We prefer, Matt and I, we prefer to use Mocha because we prefer BDD and we prefer some of the more granular control you have over the execution order of your tests in Mocha. It's just more featured to us. But we put it in, and there was just still some gaps that are going to be closed, do not get me wrong. And we can certainly close them. But the thing we're trying to finish up right now, 80% of our other code's already written in QUnit, and we already know how to do it. We installed this and ran into a few gaps, and we're just like, oh, all right, we can either take on the burden of solving this, or we could just write them in QUnit and we'll just readdress this later when it's a little bit more full featured. It's only a week old. Don't get me wrong, it looks fantastic. The stuff that is there is great. I love the approach. It extends the QUnit add-on that's built in ember-cli, and so it uses like all the base stuff and then just changes some variable references and whatever, so that way if ember-cli changes underneath, this should still continue to work. Like, I really do like where it's going. It just wasn't fully featured enough for us wanting to use it like right now without having to put a whole lot of mind space to it. We did not have room in our heads for what we're trying to get done and the timeline we're in. But anyway, ember-cli Mocha is something to keep an eye on. The creator of this is presenting at the Boston Ember meetup next month. So they did the live stream of this one last week. Yeah, last week. So my guess would be the live stream probably that one as well.
So before you go on,
Sure.
why does the order of the test matter? The order of the test.
Normally they won't. Normally your tests should not know anything about each other, and they should be able to be executed in isolation. What happens is if I have a file and I'm running 20 tests against the same piece of code, I might need to do the same setup for all of them, which in QUnit and Mocha is really easy because I can say before all these tests, like every time one of these is ran, set this up once, and then that way it's already there. I can run and run and run and run. Or I can tell it, set this up before each individual test. Well, and I hope maybe somebody has the answer.
I take it back, because it does matter. If you want to test the delete function, you probably have to insert something first.
Correct, but what you do to test that is you say, I'm testing that delete works correctly. And you're going to call the save method, and then you're going to check that it's there. And then you're going to, actually no, because you have another one that's checking that. You trust that worked. So I'm going to save. Then I'm going to call the delete, and I'm just testing to make sure the delete's not there.
Right.
So my test.
The order does matter. If you try
Well, no,
to
because
test
that
the
test had both the save and the delete in it. Because I can't test delete without save. So this could run in any order. I mean, it doesn't matter. It could run before the method that tests the saving or after, because it itself is also going to call save. Now, if this test is never going to pass, this one will break too.
Now, are you not testing? To me, that seems like you're testing multiple things then.
I'm testing delete,
Save
and I can't save. I can't delete until I save. I have another test that's testing save. That's not this test job. This test job is to test the delete functionality. If it just so happens it has to call save to put something in there, if I don't have access to raw talk to the object and set a property, if I have to go through the save method, that's fine. Because I'm okay doing that, because I have another test that's just testing save. So if this one happens to run before this one, it'll fail. But this one will also fail. And when I look at it, I might be like, oh, well, save is failing. That's why this one's failing. Because when it fails, you can give it a message and say, you can put the save and then put a little message after it. So if it fails, go, hey, save failed inside of delete. It doesn't mean your delete's broke. It means your save is broke. You need to go work on your save tests and your save code. And when you fix that, then that part of the test will work, and your delete code, assuming you wrote it right, will also work. Like, it's okay to kind of have those cross-testing, because as long as you have a test dedicated to every piece, sometimes you are going to have to chain some things together within a test. You can't get away with it. You try to minimize that as much as possible, but you can't completely get away from it, and it's okay. So those are the two popular ones, like as far as people using inside of like Ember. There are other libraries, and this is where stuff starts to cross now. So there's a QUnit BDD library that gives you BDD testing capabilities within QUnit. There's also this Pavlov library that does very similar. Square didn't use Pavlov because they needed a little bit more control over some things, so it's like a lot of Pavlov code and a little bit of their own. There's also Jasmine, which is another test unit suite that's fairly popular. There's various others, so any of these can be used. You just have to go create your own adapters for them. So remember, a couple slides ago, QUnit is the default testing suite. All the adapters have already been created for Ember and Ember-cli. Actually, they're the same adapters, but they're already there. The Ember Mocha project that we just talked about, they wrote Mocha adapters, so that way you could use it. Although I think they missed a few things. You know, again, it's still a work in progress. I think it's going to be awesome when it's done. So if you want to go, and it's fully documented how to write these adapters. If you want to go integrate any of these other testing suites in, you can. You just have to write adapters for them. And the adapters provide the functionality we're about to look at. Oh, I forgot I put this slide in here. So there's one other tool. It's an assistant tool for your unit testing. It can work with any library, and it does not need any adapters or anything like that for Ember. What this does is it assists you in your unit testing. So it does a lot of things. I just picked out the 3 most common kind of things that you'll run into. But you can fake servers of XML HTTP requests, and I don't know, there's like dozens of things that it does. But the most common things, and I was actually using these today, and I will show these later in an example, are spy, stub, and mock. So what happens is you can take an existing piece of code, because remember, you're trying to test in isolation. So I need to know that this piece of code that I'm testing makes a call over there and then continues on. Or it calls over there and then that returns me something. Like, I'm not testing that code, but I need to know that that call was actually made. So I could spy on that method or that function or that piece of code using Synod. So when I execute this piece of code, I can then, and I've wired up my spy, I can then ask the spy information about that and say, hey, when you were called, what arguments were you passed? Were you called? How many times were you called? Like all those types of things. So in this code execution path, this method should be called twice, once with this and once with that, because that's what this code does. I can spy on that method that's being called and then get that information out in order to validate that the correct logic was executed here. I don't care what that method's doing, but I need to know that it was interacted with. And that's what spy gives you within the Synod library. Stub will let you, so maybe you're testing, like today I was testing something where within our application we have a translation service. Well, when I'm doing unit testing and it gets into a method that's going to call that translation service and pass it a key and get that back, that translation service does not exist because I don't have that, I'm not running the application. I'm running that individual unit test. Well, I need to stub out that translation service so that way when that method calls that code, there's some code there that just runs as a no-op. So that way this code will continue running, but not break because that other thing wasn't defined. So a stub gives you the ability to define a new definition of an existing object or method, etc. So that way you can keep it from going down that code path. It inherits from spy, so I can still do all the spy stuff with it too. Were you ever called, that kind of thing. So let you substitute out one piece of code for another piece of defined code that you have defined. Mocks take that a step further than the stub, and you can actually program it with some logic paths. So say, when I see this argument come in, respond in this way. Because maybe your code that you're testing makes a call out to this service, and then based on what it gets back, it does one of two things. So you need to emulate, it's not enough to just stub that call so it doesn't kill your code. You need that code to be faked and respond back in a certain way so you can test the response of this code. So a mock builds on top of a stub, which builds on top of a spy. And they're very, very helpful. This is a very helpful library when you do unit testing. And it'll work with any library. It is test framework agnostic. It has nothing to do with Ember. It has nothing to do with any of the frameworks we're talking about. It's its own tool, but it works with all of them. And it's great.
Do you know whether you have worked with the stub or the real code when you use this?
Yes, you do. because you have to set it up and say, I want to spy on this, or I want to mock this.
I know, but when you're looking at the results,
No, you don't know.
you know whether you use. the
No,
same-
because all you're going to see in your results is test passed or test failed. And if they
You don't
failed,
get
here's the ones that
those
failed.
values?
Not in your results. The results of your test suite is pass or fail. And hopefully it's always green pass. That's what you always want to see.
I guess I was hoping the results had a log or something that would have had those arguments.
Oh, absolutely.
Spy.
In Spy, there are about 40 different method calls you can call on Spy. So once you've spied on a method, that now has like 40 things. You can say called how many times, called once, what was its arguments, did it throw any exceptions, what was its return value, what was the context of this. I mean, we can pull it up. There's like 40 things that you can do. So yes, as far as like in your test when you're writing, you have access to all of that stuff. And I'll show you an example. Like I was just writing spies and stubs today because, like I said, I needed to get our translation service out of the way to unit test my code. But in an application standpoint, that translation service is crucial to what it's doing. And so I needed to stub and spy on it in order to get it out of the way to test under a discrete blockout functionality through my unit test. I think this is the one I was talking about now. Yes, okay, so now we're going to get into the very specific Ember stuff and QUnit, since again, that's what happens out of the box by default for you. All right, so there are some unit test helpers. So Ember, as you know, it's got its own life cycle. It's got Ember run loops and observers and all that kind of stuff. So what happened is there are helpers to map concepts within Ember to the abilities within QUnit and how you do that testing. And so that's what these helpers do. And these are the types of things that you need to write those adapters for, so that way these helpers will continue to work in Mocha or Jasmine or any of the other ones you want to use. That's the purpose of the adapters. So we've got module 4 component, module 4 model. So if you've ever done any, like in QUnit, you've got the module, and that defines the unit under test. That's what the module 4 is for. Module 4 component, module 4 model, what this lets you do is you can pass in syntax into it as the parameter. The same syntax you use to look things up off the container. So you can say controller : product. And what this will do is when it's being tested, it knows how to automatically resolve that and get an instance of it off the container, for either as unit test or when you're doing your integration and your acceptance testing. So this does all that automatic lookup for you. You don't have to do any wiring. You use these helpers and it does all that for you. Tests are the actual tests that you're going to run. That wraps the QUnit test, but it gives you a subject method and a container method property. So the subject method gives you back an instance of the unit under test based off the resolution of the namespacing that you gave it, and the container gives you access to the actual container so you can interact with it. Again, I'll show examples of all this stuff. Set resolver, you don't really use that when you're writing your code, but it's one of those helpers where, again, it's handling that resolution between all these things and knowing how to look them all up and everything. So there's a lot of that auto magic loading stuff that you get inside of Ember. These helpers take care of all that for you, so you don't have to worry about it when you're writing your test. It was Matt, took a stab at writing adapters for Mocha about 6 months ago. And we got a decent handle on this, but there's a reason why we didn't write it. It was one of those things we got probably about 70% of the way in, and you're just like, oh, there are so many dragons over here.
Yeah.
Of course, 6 months ago, Ember 1.3 or 4, like, things change in Ember. So. All right. Then you also have some asynchronous tests. Now these are going to be used in your integration tests because these deal with your actual, again, I didn't have room to write integration/acceptance. These go towards your actual user interaction. How's the application working on the flow? So I can visit a URL. I can fill in elements in the DOM. I can click on an element. I can execute or trigger a key event. I can also just trigger regular events. So this is how I can interact with my rendered application in order to test its execution. These are asynchronous because I have to wait on things to finish. And so beneath it, it automatically wraps the Ember run loops and coordinates all that stuff for you automatically. We have synchronous ones, just so they sound. They happen in real time. There's nothing they have to wait on. So I can find, so this is very similar to the jQuery dollar question or parentheses, and then you start giving selectors. So I want to make sure that when I'm on this route, excuse me, that there's a div with an ID of blah, blah, blah inside of it. I can have reference to the $sign, which is internally to the test. That's just a reference to the rendered view, just like how you have when you did insert elements syntax. Same concept. And I can do a .find on it, and then I can start doing my selectors. There's another way you can do this as well, and I'll show you. I go back and forth just depending on my needs at the time. Current path is the current path you're in your application, current route name, current URL. You can also pause the test. I have not used this. That slide deck I pointed out earlier, I saw that from in there, and I went and saw the source code. They added this 23 days ago. It's not even documented anywhere. I have never used it. I've never played with it. I'm going to go on a limb and say it probably pauses your test execution for some reason. I don't know. I don't have a real-world example for it. But it was added 23 days ago, so it is new. And then you've got these wait tests. There's only one of them at the moment. And then. So you can basically have all those asynchronous. So say, I want to visit this, and then do this, and do this, and then do this. And so they know how to take care of themselves. And then when they're all finished, this watches all of them. And when they're all done, then you can do this code. So maybe you want to say, go to this route, fill this in, click this button, then do this, and then click that button. When that's all done, now I'm going to check and see if I actually have a modal on the screen that says blah. Because I have to wait for all those other asynchronous events to finish. So all the asynchronous helpers know how to synchronize themselves with each other, but you can wrap your synchronous code to be executed after your series of asynchronous events in the and then. And you can chain all these together. All these helpers are very BDD-ish, kinda, but not really. Again, this is where it gets, don't get hung up on the words, like just understand the concepts, because everybody has a different opinion about this. There's not a single blog post or person that has the same exact definitions of these things. You can also do your own custom test helpers, which again I have examples of. You can register a helper, which are your synchronous ones, or you can register your asynchronous helpers. So just like they already gave you the fill-ins and the visits and the finds, you can write your own. I wrote an in-array one to help me with some stuff because I was getting tired of writing a long list of tests, so I just wrapped it all into a helper. So I'll show you that. All right. So, any questions about any of that so far?
Do the asynchronous helpers not return promises, or
They do to themselves. Like you don't have to do anything.
so you don't call like find and then fill in yourself?
You wouldn't do a.
Like, why wouldn't you call find the element and do your own like promise then function, not an and then with special?
I suppose you could, but you're going to have to manage that Ember run loop yourself at that point because all the other helpers that are going on, and as each test is running, like.
If they've solved it, I just want to.
Yeah, I mean you could do that, but I think, and I have not tried it because I haven't strayed down that path. I think you're going to run into run loop issues because you're trying to schedule something in a test that now the test itself is going to be done while it's going on to another one, but it's supposed to be isolated. You're outside of it.
So
There's a reason why they created that helper and then helper. It's for.
Okay. So I did wrap
Yeah.
something
I mean,
else
you-
in there.
But even saying that, a lot of the unit tests I've run, I've had to use the Ember run loop and put stuff in it, and still.
The only documentation I've seen around how to test interaction or integration / acceptance testing for components is to put everything that's going to set a value of a component in a run loop, a run later.
Yeah.
There is probably some more work that can be done in this space.
It's
It's the best it's been.
yeah. It's. I mean, for what everything it's trying to do, you get pretty close to being like really nice. It's pretty close to being really nice.
So, Jeremy,
Yes.
I've used something like that, not in the Ember sense, but when I had to deal with animations where you couldn't quite precisely track down when things were going to finish, then you just basically run all your animation stuff within the block, and then you call a then do this function, because then you don't have to worry about those things, and all your tests can kind of run independently. But that's where I've seen it be really useful.
What
I've never
library
had
are
to
you
use it
using?
in a case like that.
What library were you using?
I don't remember. I can probably
Was
check.
it for,
It was home built everything, so we had a bit of everything. Mine actually has some.
Also, the trigger one, is there a way to trigger an observer or just the fact that observer was called was sign on or see?
you can trigger an observer. There's some, if you go to the API docs, you go down into the observers, there's something like notify when, like you call it on the object that the observer's instantiated on, it's like notify when it changed or.
Or are you asking about spying on the observer?
Those are two separate questions,
Okay.
but yeah, both, just because, sign on was another way to see if there's a way to determine if the server was called. As I've
Yeah,
always
you
said,
can definitely spy on an observer, absolutely.
Yeah, an observer you can, because an observer is really just a normal JavaScript function that Ember does some special stuff to. Computer properties are harder to spy on. That's probably another-
But, yeah, normally I just test the result of the property, so it's not so bad. Observers,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to do something else, but I just want to make
Yeah.
sure that side effect was called.
Yeah, and you could even, yeah.
I think it's notify property changes is the one that triggers whatever the observer is observing. You can call notify property changes, pass in that key, and it'll trigger the observer.
And you can also, within the context of like views or specifically components, you can also send actions. So you can trigger the actions on the routes, views, and that kind of stuff too, through those same type of helpers. You can do send and send action, whatnot. So, yeah, so the live, which we'll get to in a few moments, the live coding, we're going to have a very contrived, it's full feature, but it's a contrived example. And then, like I said, we have already written tests, like we have a keyboard shortcut library that's fully tested as far as like its interaction, triggering key events, all that kind of stuff. I've got where I'm spying on pieces inside of a component. And like, it's about the syntax of how you get to it. Like I've got a bunch of examples we can go through. All right, so running your tests. So now that you've written them, it doesn't do you any good unless you're running them. So ember-cli takes out all of the setup. You don't have to worry about it at all. That's the beauty of using ember-cli. It gives you your build environment, it gives you your application environment, it gives you everything we've already talked about with ember-cli, and it also gives you your test environment. So if you're running your ember-cli application, all you have to do is go to /tests in your URL. And voila, you will see your unit tests, and hopefully they're all green. And I'll explain what the green and red means if you don't know later. When it runs in that manner, it's going to use whatever browser engine you're currently in. So if you're loading in Firefox, it's running your unit testing against Firefox browser engine. If you're in Chrome, Safari, etc. So it's important in a moment. Something else to keep in mind is you're not going to want a tests route in your application, because this is how ember-cli works. Within dev, none of these tests make it out to production. And we'll talk about that, I think, in the next slide. If not, I'll bring it up again. So you'll be fine, but so hopefully you don't have a tests route in your URL or in your application, because you're going to have to do a little bit of configuration to make that work nicely, because it expects this URL to be there. You can also run ember test from the command line, just ember space test. It's going to use Testum as the test harness, and it's going to run Phantom.js. Out of the box, ember-cli is configured to use Chrome, but you have full control over that. You can go and change anything you want with the Phantom.js settings. The reason why I bring this up specifically is because we are in favor of using the bind function on our anonymous functions to bind scope. Phantom.js doesn't know what to do with the bind function. So if you have code like that and you run ember test from the command line, Phantom.js will laugh and laugh and laugh.
Yeah.
It'll run fine here. So one day Matt's like, hey, the tests are failing. I'm in here, right? No, they're not. Yes, they are. No, they're not. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, type this. And I'm like, I never typed that. I typed, it laughed at me, and I go, what the hell? And then I'm like, oh yeah, duh, 2 different engines are running the tests.
Phantom.js 2.0 is supposed to implement function.bind, but there's no, we don't know when it's going to come out. They're saying 2015.
So the workaround, you have 2 workarounds. One is don't run it from the command line, which in dev is kind of okay, but if you're having this integrated into your CI and your QA and all your types of builds, that's important. So you're going to have to do the whole self equals this and then pass, then you have self inside the closure to capture scope and all that kind of stuff instead of doing binds. We don't have the CI part of our application integrated yet, so we're okay with bind. We're hoping that this beats us, but we don't think it will, which we'll have to go back to the binds, yank it out, put the cells, put a to-do, issue number, blah, blah, blah. Here's another spot where these need to be put back to binds when it works.
Is there a way to just put a bind polyfill before you're testing?
Oh, you know, it's a...
We haven't
Maybe.
thought about that.
Yeah, we're just, we only have so much space in
Yeah,
here.
we're trying to write an application, not fix JavaScript.
Well, you probably could, yeah, absolutely. That means, so there's your third option.
It's
Yeah.
just a function.
And you know what? Honestly, it probably exists. I mean, we could probably Google Phantom.js not liking bind, and third result would probably be a polyfill. I'm gonna say fourth, just to be safe. Fourth result.
There's a whole bunch of issues open up against Phantom.js for not having binds. There's a lot of discussions about it.
It's the same kind of conversations we had in previous meetups, well, sometimes just very, very briefly. We are trying to use JSDoc and using the, I forget the other library, but underneath they all use the Esprima library to do code analysis. And Esprima doesn't know what to do with ES6 code yet, so it fails. So we don't have automatic linting, we don't have automatic JS hinting, we don't have automatic document generation, because all those tools are using a single library that doesn't know how to support ES6. So, welcome to bleeding edge. It's very bleeding edge. Some of the tooling hasn't caught up yet. Understandably so, ES6 has not been fully ratified yet, so I don't blame them. I don't want to write a compiler more than once. So, there's only so much you can do. So for now, we're using UI docs and calling it even on our documentation, and eventually we'll be able to run JS docs. And we're just using code reviews to catch our style guide adherence rather than an automated tool. But our hope is obviously to have that 100% automated, including this part of it. If we can get it done with our project and unit tests to cut down on the amount of bugs in our application, then it'll free up our time to come back and solve these kinds of problems. Yes.
So I Googled also. So yeah, Phantom.js is aware of the issue. They do have a polyfill
Oh,
workaround.
nice.
They have a polyfill workaround for now, and they're also going to fix it in a later version.
Perfect. Excellent idea.
It's in their GitHub.
Perfect. Yeah, we literally went no further than we're about. Okay. We added to the list of things.
Yeah.
All right. So how do you create your tests? Ember-cli, and again, I keep saying it because this is, for those of you that haven't been here for the other presentations, Ember-cli and Ember are becoming one and the same. But there is not going to be a difference in the Ember ecosystem. So if you're not already using Ember-cli, get comfortable with it. It's not going away. With Ember-cli, one of the many, many, many things you get are command line generators. So if I say Ember generate component navbar, it's going to automatically create the component file for me, the component template, and all the necessary things that make that component, put them in the correct directory structure. It's also going to create a test for me. And it's going to import the QUnit helper, something else I can't remember. And then it's going to give me my module for component helper automatically because it's a component, and it's going to create my first one that says, that it renders. And you're going to see all of this. We're going to walk through this. But anyway, it generates all these for you automatically. If you have some existing code that you had not, maybe you weren't using Ember-cli before, or you had done that and then you deleted the test, you're like, testing, I'm not doing that. And now you decided, all right, maybe I should. I was convinced after tonight's presentation. You can go back in and Ember generate component-test navbar, and that will just generate the test for the navbar component for you. So there's a couple different ways using the generators. And this works for components, routes. There's like 20 different ones of these. I just happen to pick component because that's the live coding example we're going to use as a component. So that's the easiest way. You could obviously copy and paste. You could write it by hand, all that kind of stuff. Like, you don't have to use a generator. There's not like some sort of manifest inside of Ember-cli that if you add a file by hand, you have to go and add it to the manifest or anything like that. There's nothing like that. Just this is obviously the easiest way to generate your test.
So if you change your component, you should test automatically change.
No, there is not a rename. There is not a rename generator, which would be nice. We collectively as a group could write one. Like, there isn't anything that lets you say Ember rename component and then change the name. You can't do that. There isn't anything that automates it. So if you went in and manually changed the name of your component file, you're also going to want to go and manually change the name of your test file. Now, they don't have to be named the same, but for your sanity, you're going to want them because you're going to want to know that that file's test goes with that. When it runs through the test, which I think is this one? Nope. When it goes through and runs the test, It just looks for file names with a dash test on the end, and those get ran in the unit test or in the test suite. So you could have your component called navbar, and you could call your test my test, and this test could be testing your navbar component, and that's perfectly fine. I don't recommend it because you're going to go insane, but ember-cli does not care.
I wasn't asking that, I was asking if you change your component, does it automatically change your test?
No. It does not change the content of your test, nor does it change the name of the
So
test.
the reason to do the second one is you change the component and you need it to reproduce it.
It's only going to create a skeleton for you. It will
It'll
delete.
delete all your old code.
Yeah.
Just want, if you change your component, you just want to go into your test and rewrite just what you need.
There are separate libraries that we didn't go into. I'm more familiar with them on the server side world than the JavaScript, that you can take existing code and generate unit test skeletons out of it, and it would create like tests against methods and stuff like that, but it still isn't going to write the actual tests inside because it doesn't know what it's supposed to do. Because what you wrote might be wrong, so they're not going to give you wrong tests. Like they'll get you close. They'll build the house for you. You have to paint the walls and decorate. You'll see as we start going into it, and certainly ask more questions as we go. But yeah, there's automation only take you so far, unfortunately. You can also, I don't have any examples of this. So another piece that fits into unit testing, or I say unit testing. When I say unit testing, I really mean code testing. Because you're normally running a lot more unit tests than you are the exception in integration, unless you're doing the entire application. Code coverage. So the concept of code coverage is I'm going to take every line of code that I have in my code base, every logic path, and I'm going to evaluate that, and I'm going to evaluate it against when the tests ran, whether or not all of those paths had a corresponding test that executed those lines. And that will give me a sense of how much of my code is actually covered by test cases. The higher the number, the better. Now, I have a lot more experience with that on the backend server PHP side and the tools, where you can do that, and you can get, if you're in the 80+%, 80 to 85% code coverage, it's pretty darn good, because there's some stuff that it doesn't matter what you do, you just can't get to it because of the nature of unit tests. You certainly can get higher, it just depends on the code you have and how large and that kind of stuff. But anyway, it's really great because you can look at your code file and go, this line's being tested 22 times, and here's all of the tests that are hitting it. Because maybe I need to do a save, a delete and a rename. Well, I have to call save 3 times, in each of those tests. So save getting hit 3 times. It doesn't mean that you have a save test. It means that that code was executed by 3 different tests. So in the JavaScript world, there's blanket, and there's another one I just ran across. I can't remember the name of it. There's a handful of the JavaScript ones that will do the same idea with code coverage. Well, what makes them interesting is JavaScript is a very loosely structured language. Like you can write it any way you feel like, for the most part. So it's very hard for those kinds of tools to get a handle on like what exactly is going on and like how's this being ran. So there's some nuances there. And then we were trying, again I say we, it was really Matt, we were trying to put blanket.js integration into our unit tests. And it wants to run, so Blanket expects to run against a file, like this file does this. Well, in ember-cli, your file is your entire application, all your templates, your components, your Ember code, your everything. And so Blanket goes, well, I've got these 5 tests, holy crap, what is all this? And it just freaks out. So we were working, again, Matt, when I say we were working on tying into the Broccoli build process to extract that file out individually, like throw it to a separate temp file, and then run Blanket against it separately. And it was one of those things where we're like, interesting idea, gonna have to come back. We've got other problems to solve right now.
Feel like 70% there, and we'll be like, okay, I'm done.
Yeah, it's that last 30% we're like, oh boy, this is gonna be hard.
It's like when you see the path there, and you see the path is like down a crevasse and then up a mountain.
But the concept's solid. It's the same thing we do in the tool that we can't use at the moment. It's the same thing that we do for our code style guideline checking. Like on a git pre-commit, we do a diff on the git stash, or not the git stash, but the git stage. And we pull those files off one by one into a temp, and then we can run a diff against them and the tool, and then get the results back and hold on to that name if there's any problems, and do those one by one. It's the whole idea of extracting the pieces, running this external code, and bringing it all back together again. So hopefully somebody beats us to it. but if not, it's on our radar. Maybe one day, eventually, we will integrate some code coverage stuff into the unit testing part of Ember. But it's not going to be an easy task. But that's another set of tools that exist out there too within that world that are very helpful. Okay, any questions before we go into live code? Okay, so if we start getting bogged down on time, I have this stuff already written. We'll just start copying and pasting. But shouldn't take too long. All right, so let's close that. There we go. All right, so I'm going to create a Ember new. We're going to call it testing demo. Sit around and stare at each other for a few moments because we're on the public Wi-Fi. I should have got it on private. I don't know if it's any faster though, actually. Do what?
Probably not to that side.
Probably not, yeah. So anyway, so this is generating a brand new Ember application for us, so nothing special. But I'm starting with a brand new one, so that way you can see as we start going through it. So you'll see, since we're on the screen, so it's already created the, it's got those helpers, which we'll talk about as we get into here. It's got some other test helpers. It's got the JS hint file, all that kind of stuff. So that's part of that ember-cli ecosystem that it gives you out of the box when you're making your application. All right, so node's done, power's done. Okay, great. So now I can do ember serve. Oh yeah, testing demo. You have to be inside your application to serve your application. I always forget that. That's weird. I was getting those at home too. Our live reload might be a little wonky. It works. I don't know what's going on my computer. It's intermittent, so we'll see what happens. Okay. All right, welcome to Ember.js. Sweet. So this is that out of the box. So out of the box, we can go to test. And you will see that little green bar up there. Yay, successful. So basically in testing, you've got green for everything's good, red is things have failed, yellow is like warning. So if you're on the command line, a lot of times you'll have some sort of colored output. That's kind of universal across all of the tools. So anyway, that's what they talk about. Just write your code until your tests are green. Green means good, everything passed. So in this particular case, we have no tests. This is just running against some JS hint against some of the core files that were there. So now we're going to go and actually go create some files. All right, so all right, we're going to go ahead and create a component. And I'm doing component because they're going to be your most involved pieces inside of Ember to write tests for. Controllers are very easy. They're just plain old JavaScript objects. You just hit some functions. I mean, they're really easy. Views, same way. Your acceptance testing, which we can look at, you just navigate the routes and do them. Components are those ones that kind of blur the lines between the two worlds. Sometimes you mix the syntax a little bit in order to accomplish what you need to. So we're going to use a component as our example. So we're going to Ember generate a component, and I'm going to call it calculator. Really? Calculator tool. Okay. Oh, yeah, I wasn't in this one. No, I am. Okay. So it created our calculator tool component, it created our calculator tool template, and it created our calculator tool test for us automatically. So if we come back over here and rerun our tests, there's still nothing. Oh, because because this is a weird thing. All right, so. Oh, gee whiz. Half a circle. I have too many environments. We'll deal with this for a little while, and I'm probably going to copy and paste because if it's not going to be a live reload, this is going to be a pain.
What's wrong with you?
I don't know. It just started acting up last night when I was running through this again. I don't know what it's doing.
Do you have like a process you want?
I don't know. So here's our test now that I just created. So we can go specifically to it right here. We can also, we can turn off the JS hint so that we don't have to see them. Basically, same idea. So anyway, there's just one test and it renders. So if we go look at the test, because this is the one it gave to us out of the box. Here's our test, here's our unit, components folder, calculator test. So here's our module 4 component that automatically got created for us because it knew we're generating a component. It uses it right here. It knows that it's the calculator tool component. That's how it knows how to do the automatic resolution off the namespace. And it gives us out of the box the fact that it renders. So remember I talked about how the test helper gave us the subject method. It also gives us, it also gives us a pen, I forgot about that, and container, which we don't have here. So basically, the component is this subject is an instance of the component before it has been rendered to a view or out to the DOM. So it's in a pre-render state, which is what they're testing here. And then once you've appended it to the DOM, it's now in DOM. So because components are tied to views, if you've got the view lifecycle, you have all these different render states. So you have the ability to interact with the component in both capacities. When it's as an object before it's been rendered, and then also after it's been rendered. So you have both sides that you can talk to a component. All right, so that's the test. So let's go start adding some stuff. So we go into here, let's go into our templates component. All right, so that's what we get out of the box. I'm going to get rid of that just for the sake of this. We're going to make a calculator, so this is a calculator component. So we're going to do an input, we'll call this digit 1. So initially, you'll notice I'm not doing test-driven development. We will switch to TDD. What you'll find, especially if you aren't familiar with how to do testing inside of Ember, a lot of times you're going to write it first, and that way you know it's working the way you want, or at least it's close to the way you think it's supposed to be working. And then you can start writing your test because you're like, well, I know I've got this data sitting there, like how might I possibly get to it? Once you get good enough that you know, oh, this is all the scenarios in which I need to test a component, and you know how to write those tests, you can certainly do 100% TDD. But you'll find, as I have a lot of times, I'm like, I'm going to add this to the component because I don't know what the test should look like first. Like, I know it should be there. I don't even know what the syntax should be. So let me put the functionality in, see what I have access through to in the debugger. Oh, I get how it's rendering on the container. Okay, great. Now I can write a test and pull it off and test against it. So it's a little bit of a hybrid depending on your familiarity with the ecosystem. All right, so we do another one. So like I said, I'm pretty much just writing the whole thing, and then we'll switch over to it here shortly.
How did you know operation is bad?
Because that's all this calculator can do at the moment. The TDD part of it is where we introduce other functions. We'll make sure we've even got just the idea down first, and then we'll switch over to adding more stuff. So for right now, let's see if it's going to work. I just need to write a
You didn't
script
have
that
to
just
bill?
redoes that. Do what?
You didn't have to bill again?
Yeah, I did. Hang on. My mistake, I'm jumping ahead of myself. We need to use the component that we just created. I'm really close to copying and pasting. Live coding always seems like such a good idea until you do it.
Seems a good idea the night before when you're just trying to finish up your
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't want to make any more slides. I'll just wing it. All right, so, so there's our calculator component. That's not doing anything. We haven't written any logic yet. We've only done the template. But you get where we're going with this. We're creating a calculator. So you put in 2 numbers, you hit the calculate button, and your answer should show up here. That's what we're about to go do. So we're going to go put in the code, and then we'll start putting the tester on this. So this is our actual calculator component here. So I'm going to create an actions. I'm going to copy and paste this. All right, so we now have a calculate action that we just programmed. So let's make sure it works, and then we'll come back and look at the code. Oh, so, okay. So now that I introduced, well, okay, let's make sure this works first, and then I'll show you the other stuff. All right, so I'm gonna put in 3 plus 9, calculate, okay, I get 12, right? So we've got a calculator. So now we have something to test. All right, so coming back to here when we did the build, you'll notice that it's complaining with the $ is not defined. Where's the $ coming from? Well, I just happened to put it in here because I was using it to go and grab an element out of my DOM and write to it. So what I would do for here is, it's just because of the setup. I can go into my JS hint file. Oh, no, wrong one. I need to go into my applications JS hint file. And I just need to tell JS hint, hey, you know about this, quit complaining. And so then everything will be fine. That's because we start with a brand new application. If you're an existing one, it doesn't have anything to do with testing per se. I just want to point that out. All right, so okay, so now we've got that. All right, so now let's go and do some tests. So we've got that first one that it renders. So now it should still be passing. Rerun the test. Good, it's still passing because it's rendered and it's pre-rendered and rendered state. So all is well. All right, so now we're going to do some tests. So, let's look at the code real quick so we know what we're going to test. So there's a calculate action here. So right here, let me get rid of this one. So we have our 2 input fields. We've got a hard-coded plus sign, we've got the equal, etc. When you click this button, it's going to call the calculate action on our controller, or excuse me, our component. The calculate action rather, is grabbing the value of both of those input fields. I'm not saying this is how you should write your code, and it will get better through refactoring in our tests. But bear in mind this is very, very, very simple proof of concept code. If you put a plus sign in front of it, it automatically casts it as a number, so you can't make strings later because you will. And then basically we only want to do the addition if there are 2, both of them have a value in them. And then we literally are just adding them together and setting their text value of that div, that ID, or that span of that ID into it. So that's all we got going on. All right, so we've got this template right here. So the first thing I want to do is, and I'll touch on this a little bit, and then I will leave it for conversation afterwards. Oops. Test. All right, I'm going to test certain aspects of the DOM, or the template. So, and feel free to ignore Gerald, we talked about this a little bit. DOM is the, what's the word? Purview of the integration and acceptance testing, like what's being rendered. And unit tests deal with, does my logic do what it's supposed to do? My methods, if I call this, do I get this type of response? However, in my opinion, and you're welcome to have your own, I'm not saying this is absolutely correct, but I'm seeing examples of this, it makes sense to me and some others I've talked to. If I'm going to have a component, not a view, not a controller, not application logic, but an actual component whose reason for being is to encapsulate functionality for reusability. I want to use this 1,000 places in my application. To me, we have a responsibility to make sure that that component is a little more stable than just some willy-nilly anybody can change the template. There's expected functionality tied either to the way it looks or to its behavior. If this was a calendar component and there wasn't an input field if you put in a date, is it a calendar component anymore? So that's kind of the place I'm coming from. So I'm not testing that I've got 12 nested divs with this particular span, or that type of stuff, or there's 22 pixels or that kind of stuff. That's not what I'm dealing with in the component unit test. But I am going to test some things, like make sure that there's a element with an ID of answer to put the answer. and make sure that there are 2 input fields. Like, these things are core to how this calculator, as we designed it so far, work. Because if I don't have these things, then this component is not going to function correctly. Now, I didn't say how you could style them or where to put them. You could put them in a table. Like, I don't care where they are. I'm just making sure that they exist. So does that make sense? And I'm not saying this is a hard, fast, like, this is the correct way according to the Ember team. But in my mind, having written components that are, again, encapsulated functionality for reusability, you need to have some way to know that you haven't broken the provided functionality. So we have our component, which, looking at that, I actually don't even need that code. This would be perfectly fine, just like this. You don't need to have it. That's why if I wanted to interact with it from like an object standpoint. In this case, I truly just want to render it to the DOM, so that way I can get access to some of the DOM elements. So I'm going to create a reference to called component. I'm going to append it to my DOM, and then I'm going to use that find helper to go find input fields. And I'm going to look at the length of that array, and does it have 2 in it? I'm going to see if there's a button, does it have 1 of them in it? And is there some sort of element that has an answer? I don't care if it's a div, span, I don't care. But my code up here certainly does. So I'm going to make sure that my test cares. Now again, I'm not saying that you should part tying your actual component to a specific ID like that. Again, code could be better. Conceptually, if that's what we're going to have, then we need to make sure that we've got it. So if we go rerun that test, or run our test suite rather, we now are still passing, and we have 2 tests. Correct DOM structure is represented, and the first one that was that it renders.
So isn't it supposed to be in that bottom right panel?
So what this is here, and we'll see it here. Let me take this off. You might see it a little bit better. No, we're almost there. This is the actual application running. This is a test div. It's a div with an ID of ember testing, ember test. Ember.cli creates that for you automatically. Because what happens is when you're doing your functional integration test, it'll literally run your application there, so it can visit the routes and fill things in. That's where it renders.
But the reason you're not seeing anything in there because it just flashes in there. Like when the tests get torn down, the application gets torn down and popped down.
Yeah, correct. I'll be able to show you on our own internal app where it takes a little bit longer for things to run. You'll be able to see it go through each iteration.
But if you pause, like if you're in the debugger and you pause
Yeah.
it, you can see stuff.
And in a moment, what will happen is this is, I adjust the opacity because otherwise you can't read, like when your tests fail, you can't read your messages because it's sitting on top of it. So I go in and adjust the opacity of this, which I'll show in a moment. It's obviously easy enough to do, but once we have enough tests, you'll see what I'm talking about. And you're like, oh, this is annoying. All right, so now let's switch over to TDD. So now that we actually have a component, and we've got some passing tests, now we can switch over to doing more of a TDD style of development. So I'm going to save you from the iteration of all of them. I'm just going to copy and paste. So the idea again behind test-driven development is I'm going to create test conditions for all the things that that I expect out of my code. I expect, now notice that there is no actual code. I've just got tests at the moment. If I go run these tests, they will fail. And you notice there's not an opaque block over here. All these tests fail because there is no code. They're not passing tests. But that's fine because this is test-driven development. We start with our tests. So I am going to take a oh-so-minor detour into our test index file. And I am going to go add opacity. What do I know myself? That'll catch on the next one. It makes it much more pleasant to look at. All right. So what I've done in our tools, in our test here, is I've said I expect there to be an add method. Again, this is just syntax. I can write anything I want. Just knowing the syntax I follow, add tells me that, oh, I expect there to be an add method. And it should sum the arguments that it's passed. Add's also going to accept an infinite number of arguments. Add is going to accept non-number argument values. And add is also going to return null if no arguments are passed to it. So I have defined the expectations that I have for the add method. It does not exist yet. Make sense? We're driving our development by failing tests. All right. So we're going to take this first one. Add is going to sum our arguments. So let's write the test that we would expect to continue to fail, but when the code exists, should work correctly. Notice I'm using equal. Okay, so the first test was add is going to sum its arguments. So I got a reference to my component itself from the this subject helper. So that's component. I'm going to call the add method. I'm going to pass it some arguments. And it's going to return to me, I expect the result of component add being passed 1 and 4 to equal 5. So this is my equal. I expect this condition to be equal to this condition, or value. And I'm going to call this, it's going to return to me. So this test is still going to fail if I go run it, because we haven't written any code yet. But now I have something to write my code against. In order for this test to pass, it must satisfy this logic.
So why would you use this subject, which is, you said, prior to render?
Because this has nothing to do with the component being rendered into the DOM. At this point, this is where the components, this is why I pick components, they're kind of weird. I don't need it to be rendered to the screen in order to test its add method. That's purely JavaScript object code. It has nothing to do with any DOM thing. This is where, again, components, that's why I picked up components, kind of cross those lines, because in this test, you do care about what's being rendered, and here we don't. This is still all a unit test. Even though this deals with the DOM, this is still a unit of like, are these specific things here? Because otherwise, as a whole, I am going to fail. So again, that's what I said before, where those words, like the words we use and the definitions we use are correct, but you have to loosen your application of them when it comes to components. You have to be willing to accept that you could be doing integration-y things inside of a unit test. You just have to keep your right frame of mind of like, what exactly am I testing and how am I testing it? We're testing the core logic that's controlling the output, not the actual output. Okay, so if we go run this, I won't do the restart. It's still going to fail. Same thing. So now what I can do is I'm going to go to the. Let me move these out of the way. Okay. So now I'm going to come in here. I'm going to add an add method. Let me go show you actually that it fails because the error message isn't working. All right, if we run that test, let me turn off JS hint because those get annoying. So it's going to say undefined is not a function because in our test we call component.add, right? So, and you notice now it's opaque. So, he stepped out. But anyway, it's opaque. So now I'm going to go add the add function to our actual code. So now when I run it, it's still going to fail because it's not going to pass those tests, but you're going to get a different error message. Because now, add exists, but now it's telling you that it expected it to equal 5, its result was undefined. Therefore, here's your diff, and you still have a failing test. Which test failed? The one called add sums argument, etc. So I'm not saying you literally have to like, oh, let me go add the add, and then rerun it, and then go add it. So you can do multiple things at once. TDD means to you whatever you want TDD to mean in actual implementation. Again, this is just presenting that concept overall. So now I'm going to go in and still, make that code actually. Oh, that's weird. Oh, never mind. I printed it twice. Okay, so I'm going to do A and B as my arguments. For no reason, it doesn't matter. I'm going to return A plus B. I mean, that's an add function, right? Take in two arguments, add them up, return the value. So do we expect our test to pass or fail?
Number one.
I would expect it to pass unless I did something horribly wrong. I did.
You passed it in an array, right?
Yeah, I got ahead of myself.
wasn't sure if that was like a JavaScript trick or.
No. That was.
'Cause I know in Ruby you can like dump lists.
Oh,
So-
yeah. No, that was me late last night deciding live coding was an excellent idea.
He's smart.
Hey, look at that. Our add some arguments test now passes. All right, so you get the general idea. I'm going to do a lot more just copying and pasting here. So we've got accept our I guess I have an extra test. Good thing I wrote them down. I had an extra one that I did not have in that original. Because I said it sums arguments. Now I want to. Oh, I should need this.
Now I want
That's
to
right.
understand how are you going to test infinity?
So that
Add
one
2
is
gig numbers, 1 to 2 gig, and say add.
no. So I got a little bit creative because again, as long as I can, yeah. I'll explain.
Infinity is more than.
So infinite, I just changed it to accept the variable. I apparently had a mismatch between my code, but it doesn't really matter. So same idea here. Let me just walk over real quick. I'm going to get my component. I'm going to call the add apply or component add again, but instead this time what I'm doing is I'm creating. Okay, so I'm going to create a random number of variables to pass to the add to emulate this infinite number. I'm saying 50. It could pass up to 50 to this thing in my test. Is it accurately testing infant? No. You have to make a compromise at some point, like in this case, because I mean, you can test really large numbers. The point is I should be able to throw random amount of variables to this thing, and if it functions correctly, I'm making a decent assumption that the code isn't implemented by having A, comma, B, comma, C, comma, D, comma, E, comma, F, comma, G. Like, the hope is it's implemented by looking at the length of the arguments passed in and looping over them, therefore it can accept an infinite number of parameters or arguments. So this kind of lets me get the best of both worlds. I'm like, all right, look, reasonably, I pray somebody did not put A through Z and then AA through AZ and then that would be 52. So AA through AY or X, whatever. You get the idea. Like, I really hope if I go look at that function, and of course right now I'm the one writing because I'm doing TDD, right?
But is it static?
No, it's completely like this is
So
gonna.
meaning you call it, but you call it, say, with an array.
Correct.
Something else is, as it's called, and as it's processing, is adding elements to the array. So it was called, and there were 20 elements in the array. As it's working through the 20 elements, there's now 23. And it's working now through the elements, and now there's 25. And it's working through the elements, and now there's 30.
JavaScript doesn't
And
do raise
who
that
gets to
way.
the end
JavaScript
of
doesn't
the
work like that. It's
array first.
But even if it did, it would still work. Because it's just going to loop over them. So it would be a race of loops, except for it doesn't pass arrays that way. It passes its values in time at the moment, but it does have a reference to them. But it doesn't let you continue to add to it.
So it will be static then, as far as this call is concerned.
It would be, when it's called, the elements in the array represented would be static, even though they have a reference back to them. It's for modification in scope. But even if they weren't static, and you had something adding more elements to your array faster than the function was looping through it, they just keep going. I mean, it's an infinite. As long as there's arguments to loop over. So
It's single threaded. There's no way you can have something modify the array while your function's executing.
unless your function you're executing is adding to the array inside
Yeah,
the
I
loop.
mean,
Then you're just a
didn't
bad
learn yourself.
programmer.
It can't be something mysterious. There can be nothing external that modifying that reference. Like even though it does pass object reference, there's no way for another function to simultaneously doing that because it's an event loop in the browser, so it's going to execute that function all the way through unless you call set timeout or something.
So essentially, again, I just picked 50. I randomly do this. So sometimes when it runs this test, it might be 1.
And choose the range of numbers from 2 gig
Sure, I mean, numbers are relevant. I mean,
Well,
you're
I
doing
want to make
math.
sure you handle the flows, you know, that you're not all having to fit into big ints.
Sure, I mean, you'd have to write more tests for it. I mean, this is truly just a very basic approach. The concept's the same. If you need that type of limitations, you have to write some tests that say that arguments can't exceed, you know, a certain thing, and they have to be a certain type. Like, you would do a lot more testing. This isn't the only test that you would need for a calculator, nor am I saying that this is a well-designed calculator. It's just more about the concept. So if this is how, you know, we're willing to accept a variable number of arguments, then the code I'd have to write, instead of having, you know, 2 arguments here, I need to accept a variable number, would be something more along this lines, where I'm going to loop over every argument that came in, and I'm going to add it to an ongoing total, and then I'm going to return that total out. And so this code would satisfy the requirements of the test that we previously wrote. And I'll double check it real quick so that way we don't get 5 tests down the road and then there's something wrong and we have to go back. But it should be fine because I'm copying and pasting, right? What could go wrong? All right, so now that test is passing, right? So we started with 4, we've done 2, we've added code for them. Again, this is TDD. It's as fun as it looks. All right, so let's go to the next test here. So the next test was that it accepts non-number arguments. So in this particular case, I'm now passing it a letter in here. You know, I'm throwing an A.
Pass it apple and orange.
Sure, I can do that.
So is the sum going to be a concatenated string instead of addition?
Well, it depends on what you want your function to do. So I would argue that this test should be more specific in how you want it to be added. But for the sake of this demonstration, what we are going to do via the magic of copying and pasting is, because I want to get onto the other stuff I want to show you guys, is we're going to modify our add function now. Now, if I went and ran that, it's going to fail, tell me blah, blah, blah. I'm going to come over here and modify it, because now, instead of just doing the totaling, I'm now going to check and say, hey, only if you're a number are you going to do the totaling. So I'll accept any non-number thing in, I'm just going to ignore it when I'm doing the adding. Now again, that's because that's how I chose to solve that test. Now, just because I solved the test doesn't mean the code's right. Maybe there's supposed to be a different expectation. Again, I would argue, or you know, advise that there should be additional tests that are more granular. There should be, you know, more of them, that kind of stuff. So again, more about the concept. Don't get hung up on the fact that you can still make this code fail. You can. So now if we go run that.
In programmers' terms, what does add of a string or a character mean?
It depends on your language.
How about English?
No, it depends on your programming language. Every language handles it differently. JavaScript, if you're not casting them as numbers, it's going to concatenate them together. It won't do math. So you'll end up with 1 apple, orange, 2, 3, 4 as a string if you're not casting them as a number or you're not doing the is-nan, which is not a
So it's
number.
more like a concatenate.
Well, the plus sign concatenates strings unless it knows they're numbers. And then if they're numbers, it'll add them. There's still gray area around that statement, but just roll with it. So anyway, so that test passed. And so then let's go look at our last test, which in this case we want to say that add will return null if no arguments are passed. And so again, I'm getting my component, I'm going to call add, but I'm not passing it anything, and I would expect to get back a null. And so in this particular case, then what I need to do is go modify my code a little bit more in order to pass that test. So right now, instead of setting total equal to 0 and then returning it, I'm instead going to only return total if it's greater than 0. Otherwise, it'll be a no op on the function, it'll come back as a null to the other one. And
Wait,
yes,
no.
ma'am.
What if you're past -3 and 1?
Yeah, like I said, you need more tests then. You're absolutely right. There needs to be more tests. This is a positive number calculator. You get the idea. You're absolutely right. Like everything you can think of that you could possibly break it, you need a test for it. Because if you have not defined the expected parameters for your code to operate in, then your code can do whatever anybody asks of it. You need to lock down
Well,
its
I guess my
functionality by
concern
describing
is
via
that-
test what do you expect of it.
I guess my concern is we said that it would return null if no arguments were passed.
Correct.
So it really needs to test if the argument count was 0, the answer is null.
Yes, that would be correct. I completely agree. You're right.
Not that the sum is
Which-
anything to do with 0 or positive.
This is one of those, you're absolutely right. That's one of those moments as a presenter that I was like, man, I wish I could have planned this. You are absolutely right, because watch what's going to happen. My test passed, but the code is wrong. So you're absolutely right. So tests are awesome, but if you write bad tests, or you write bad code, we have passing tests. I'm going home for the weekend. See ya, suckers. Check it in. Stuff breaks. I get a phone call, I'm like, test passed. Talk to you Monday. I hang up the phone. Poor Jerome, he's been here 2 weeks. He's the one stuck having to fix it. I come in on Monday and he's like, I hate you. I'm like, hey man, test passed. No, you're absolutely right. This is a perfect example. Yep, test passed, code is wrong. So, that was pretty much, let me do a functional test real quick, and that way we can get on to some of the other examples I have that we don't have to do live coding on. Okay. I could do this in the generator, but I'm just going to do it through here real quick. I'm making a functional test, or I'm making a functional folder in my test directory, and then I'm making a components folder inside of it. And then I'm going to create a calculator tool test.js file. All right. Then I'm going to copy and paste this wonderful magic. All right. So now we switched over. So that was all unit testing. So now we're going to come at this component from a functional testing standpoint. You could also say that this could be integration or acceptance testing. It just depends on what role that component plays in your application, that kind of stuff. So again, a little bit of a gray area, but for the sake of this conversation, we're going to call this functional. We're actually going to, we define the logic that drives it. Now we're going to see if it functions as expected. So, so in this case, we have an additional helper that we're going to use, the start app helper that comes bundled with ember-cli. And what that lets us do is inside of our module for component here, we can do a setup and a teardown. This is actually going to stand up our actual application. So this is where, again, it's kind of integration and acceptance testing because it's running in the app, but we're testing the functionality of the component. So again, however you want to refer to it. So what we're going to do, I have no idea why that's called test A, but anyway, it works. We're going to append the component to the view. We're then going to use our fill-in helpers because that template right here is what's being rendered into the DOM. So we're going to fill in an element of this selection and an element of that selection. So we're going to have our two input fields, and we're going to give them a value of 5 and 4. Then I'm going to click the button. And then, when that's all done, there's our and then helper. I'm going to find the answer, look at its text, and I would expect it to equal 9. So for now, I'm going to change this to 19 because I would expect this to fail. We have a failing test. We expected 19, the result is 9. That's because I typed it wrong here. And if I go back and rerun this, which again, you don't have to normally do this if your environment's set up correctly. I'll have to figure that one out. Now it passes. So what we did here is we used the rendered element and we navigated its DOM structure with the provided helpers in order to interact with the component. We didn't call the add function, because what happens is when I click this button, well, that button is calling our calculate action, right? And our calculate action on our component is then doing this type of logic. Oh, we skipped a step. I would have replaced this and it actually would have called add, but you get the idea. I was trying to save some time. But anyway, so we're interacting with its rendered capabilities versus its underlying logic that's driving it all. And so you can test both sides of the component this way. And the syntax that you see here for this is the exact same syntax if you were testing a controller or a route or anything else. Like you could visit and then you could fill in and then you can click. So you could actually have an application test. They're called acceptance tests in Ember.cli. They call them functional, or excuse me, they call them integration and test in Ember, and then functional is what they generate them as. Like again, it's a weird, just kind of roll with it. But anyway, you could have an application acceptance test, and it says go to this route and then do this, and then go to that route and then do this, and go here and fill this in and click the button. This is how you can start interacting with your actual application and see that there's two things in your DOM and all that kind of stuff. So that is how you write some tests. I'm going to go show you actually already written examples, and we can go through them, in a lot more context than just some contrived stuff. But that's that. If anybody has any questions before we move on to the actual, I can show you some very interesting examples. Okay.
So actually, no method or mechanism for doing keystrokes like
Yes, there's key event.
tab input.
Yes, there's a key event helper. And so you can trigger key events.
But I mean, can you put the input in as if the user would be doing it in the screen?
Oh yeah, that's what the fill in is. Unless you want it keystroke by keystroke, then you're going to have to write something that says,
Cursor home is here, so input value, tab, input value, tab, input value.
yeah, if you wanted to test your tab
There you
indexes,
go, fill in because you said what name is given to the field that gets
right.
filled in with this value.
If you want to test your tab indexing
But if it's
in an application,
keystroke,
you're going to have to write your own. You're going to have to select which field you want to start with, give it focus. You're going to have to move to it. You're going to have to emulate a tab event, move. Then you have to do a query of the DOM to find which element has focus and verify that that's the one you expected to have focus. Emulate a tab click, recurse the DOM to find which element has focus, determine, with another test, is this the one that I expected? And I'd write this in like some sort of recursive function, but that's exactly what you have to do. If you have 9 of these, you're going to have to emulate, identify, verify 9 times in order to test. There's not like a helper out of the box. Now you could write your own helper, like a tab helper that does that kind of thing if you find yourself doing this over and over and over again. It's very easy. I'll show you an example, not of a tab helper, but of a custom written helper. Yeah, I mean, what they give you out of the box is that generic, hey, this is going to handle 85% of what you need. If you need something like that, you have to ask if it's that important to be testing, and or then you're going to have to write some of your own stuff. And you'll be doing it either with the find and the key events in here, or you can actually just do it with jQuery itself. Like, you can mix those two worlds, and they're pretty much the same difference.
So you don't normally test, say, many of your
I'm not going to test
type apps by the keystroke plug?
Well, okay, well, 2 things. I wouldn't concentrate on test a tab index unless it was very important to a specific UI design. And even though I just gave that example, I just thought of a better one, I wouldn't do it that way. I would get all of the elements that I expect to have tab indexing on them, and I would look at the tab index attribute, and I would look at them that way. I'm not going to emulate user action. Emulating the tab key and that it moves where it's going to go, that's a browser thing. I trust that the browsers are working. I don't need to test that. Unless I know there's something else in the application that might sometimes grab control of the tab key and I need to make sure that's not happening, then I need to emulate it. Otherwise, I'm going to grab all of the elements that I expect to be ordered in a certain way, look at their tab index property or attribute on them, and look at it that way. I wouldn't emulate user activity. So that's my second and final answer. All right, let's. I'm going to get into our code base here. So, okay, so that's the end of the presentation. Yay, okay, great. Feel free, you're not gonna hurt my feelings if you leave. So internally here at Software, we are working on a variety of things. We talked about it a little bit before. We're working on a bunch of different Ember add-ons. And one of them is a translation add-on. Another one, I can't type my password and talk at the same time. Another one is a data layer model or data layer add-on. And another one is a bunch of UI components. So we're going to kind of bounce around between them, but I can show you a bunch of different tests that we have in place for these things. We also have an application that's written that's consuming all of these things, which gives you another exposure to how we're doing tests. Let's look at, we can look at something I just wrote today. I wrote some unit tests and a helper. So I wrote that's not what I wanted. I wrote a in-array helper, and I'll show you how we use it here in a moment. Let me pull it up quick so you can see how we're using it. Okay, so and I'll come back up to these other ones real quick. So right here, I'm again on a component. I'm in a unit test, but I'm looking at some DOM saying that there's got to be a few elements there, otherwise this component will not function correctly. And so what I'm doing is when you go and get a reference to your component, when you append it, you can ask it for properties, so like class name. Well, you don't just get back the class name that you have attached to your component. You're in the Ember ecosystem, so you have Ember View, and you have a bunch of other Ember stuff as well. So you're going to get back more than just the one you want. And so what was happening is I was like, it was becoming a pain to test it. Like I'd have to say, oh, well, I want to pull off class and then give it a name and pull off just that one. Well, if I need to know if it's a combination of two, like this is a button, I needed it to be both this class and this class. And so it was getting really hard to like keep writing these things over and over and over. So what I did is I wrote an in-array helper, which I'll go look at, which solved that problem. I can basically say, hey, I know I'm going to get back an array of stuff. Great, I don't care how long it is. In that array are any of these things in that array. This can be an array itself. It can be a single string. And so then when it calls the in-array helper over here is going to, so I've got this overall manage contain state because as soon as it finds one that does not belong, then it's going to bail out. So I've got this up there running. It's just going to keep track of that state for me. And then if it is a string, I'm going to split it apart on the spaces because if it comes from this format, like we just saw, you ask for the class property, it's space delimited classes. Otherwise, it could just be a normal array, so I can use it both ways. So I've done some normalization in here. And then if it's not an object, then I make it an array. So anyway, I'm just doing a bunch of normalization so I can then do some comparison. And then I'm going to go through each one of those, and I'm going to manage the contain state. And then I'm going to say, okay, when I've tested all of this, I'm either false or I'm true. I'm going to okay it. And then that's going to, and I'm going to save my message that was passed in over here. So this is the message that gets thrown. So instead of me having to find a way in my code over and over and over again to use an okay to say, is this inside of here, I wrote a helper to do it. And all I had to do was throw it in my test helpers folder, give it a name, make sure I'm exporting it, and you can do whatever export function you want in your format. You can just say export the actual function name instead of what I did. It doesn't matter as long as you follow the syntax. And then to use it, all I did, I have an extra space. All I did was import my helper as an array, and now there you go. So you can do a helper per file. You can do multiple helpers in a single file. It's up to you. There are some ember-cli add-ons out there that have test helpers. We're now using this in array in 2 different code repos. And so on my work for tomorrow is I'm going to create our own add-ons that has our helpers in it. And I'm going to look at the ones that are out in the ecosystem and see if I want to extend those and pull those in because they're helpful, or if we're going to branch off on our own because we don't like any of those. But there's no reason why this add-on couldn't be smart and you could register other add-ons with it. And this could be the one add-on to rule all the other add-ons. Because if I'm writing it, why not? Because that would be very easy to do. So who knows? But the point is, I want to be able to share this helper between multiple code repositories. Because I'm using it both in the SL components repository, and I'm also using it in the control portal repository. And I'm sure there's other places we'll need it as well, 7.7. So that's an example of how you can write a helper. You can make them do whatever you want, obviously. This is just a need that I had at the time. And I had to, I was using it in some other file, and I was trying to see if the keys on the object were in the array. Well, those aren't an array. And I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna have to like go change my array. My in array needs to be smarter. Like if I'm actually an object, then I got to do all this other stuff. And I was like, or I could take the easy way out for now, and instead of passing it the object, I could give it the Ember object keys, which returns an array. Hey, look, now my in array still works. And so I just modified when I passed my helper instead of making my helper smarter. Now I need to go make my helper smarter, but it worked for now. I just put an issue in my issue tracker, so I can come back to it later. All right, so that's an example of that. So here's some things that I did. So this is your out of the box. It existed in renders. This is just a component that provides some visual reference. Like if you have basically it's how many things have you looked at. You have 5 unread emails out of 20. You have 27 open tickets out of 64. You know, that type of thing. So this gives it some nice little tooltip capabilities and some visual rendering and whatnot. So one of the things I needed to make sure of is this one is an interesting thing because the actual code, if I go look at the component, if I look at the component's template, it itself actually uses another component. And it's very important that it uses that component. So again, this goes back to that whole, you know, what do I expect out of my component? So I expect the dashboard open tickets button component to make use of the SL tooltip component. I wanted this to be a set in stone requirement of the functionality. So in my unit test, I ensured that this happened. This credit goes out to Alex Speller. He wrote the router in Ember and various other things. I was talking with him this morning in IRC because I had a really stupid way of approaching this, and I kept running into problems. And I'm like, this has got to be so simple. He's been in my code, tossed it out, started talking to Alex. He's like, well, have you tried this? And I'm like, no, because that would work. Like, why would I start with that? And so 5 minutes later, I'm like, oh, look at that. It's working exactly the way it should have. And then I went and fixed a bunch of other things and blah, blah, blah. So, you know, go open source. So what I did is I wanted to make sure that the correct DOM structure is in place. So again, similar to what we did before, I'm making sure that it's got certain divs with classes like, you know, this is inside of an anchor tag. See here, this is an anchor, so it has a div inside of an anchor tag, because again, this structure is very specific to how it works on top of Twitter Bootstrap. And if you don't have this DOM structure, it won't work. So I'm being very specific in my testing, because otherwise, if people go in here mucking with it, it's not going to function. However, how do I make sure that it's using an SL tooltip? So the incorrect way that I was attempting to solve this was to actually pull the template out of the container. Well, they're precompiled, you get a function. So I was like, well, you got a prototype. I can start mucking around and digging around in the function. So I started doing that and that. You can tell right away that was wrong. If you're ever doing anything in Ember and you're like, this doesn't feel right, or this is very complicated, you're not doing it right. That was my first 5 minutes this morning. I'm like, I need a different direction. And so anyway, the solution, and the reason I point this out is it might come handy with you guys later, is I have a container property I mentioned. That's something else that you get as part of that test helper. So what I've done is the template of this component says SL tooltip, and that's what it's going to render. Well, where does it get that? It grabs it off of the container. So what I'm doing is I'm going to create my own component. So my component is an Ember component extend. I'm going to give it a special class name. It doesn't matter, I say special. It could say Jeremy was here. It does not matter. It's something I can uniquely identify and know that it's mine and not anything else's. Then I'm going to grab this container and I'm going to register my component as component SL tooltip. And what I've done is I replaced the existing component registered as component SL tooltip with my version of the SL tooltip component. So now, when I append it, and it uses that template, and it renders that SL tooltip component, my component is what's being rendered. So then, I can look at its class name and see if it has test class on it. Because I don't want to look at the DOM structure of what SL tooltip component renders, because it's a third-party library, although it's our own. Because SL Tooltip might change the way it needs to render, and I want to be able to have that flexibility. All I require of this component is that it's using that component. And I don't want to look and see how it's being rendered. I just want to make sure that that's what it's using to do the rendering. Does that make sense?
So you don't have to deregister that kind of? Your container is rebuilt every time?
Well, the test, this Scott container is isolated to the test.
Okay.
You shouldn't have any problems, which, you know, it's an interesting question because down here I do some spying and I restore the methods that I'm spying on, and I'm not even sure that's necessary either. But good code is good code, which means either this is really good and the other one isn't, or like the point is, you know, to some extent, you know, maybe I should have said, you know, I should have looked it up, held on to it, did what I did, and then put it back. But the reality is, I don't even need these because you have isolation within, excuse me, within each test you have isolation. By default, you can screw that up if you start talking this stuff outside the test, especially when you're in those functionals and you're starting that out and tearing it down. Like, you know, you can start sharing things. So just be cautious. You're thinking about it correctly. You're fine here, but you could reach out to some other stuff eventually.
So is it like an implicit app reset call, like that?
So in here, there is no app reset. It's truly like everything's in isolation. It's a new instantiation of the component itself because there is no app running. Now, when you append it, you are appending it to a view, but it's still like its own fake app. Like it's there, but it's not your app. It's a test app that has isolation. Versus if you go into a functional test, which we can look at, where you actually start the app, then it's actually your entire app ecosystem, which is why they're geared more towards the application or acceptance/integration testing. But you'll see them referenced as functional testing. Like, I wish they were consistent. Even if they were wrong, I wish they were consistent in when they call these things and the file names that get generated.
I see.
So,
It says there's no start app.
yeah. So if you see start app, you're in functional, or well,
Yeah.
functional, more so acceptance and integration. If there are no start apps, then you're truly unit.
Okay.
Even though in a unit we are rendering.
Yeah, that's cool. It's starting its own view, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Because the component's that weird thing where it has a foot in both worlds.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to see how this component interacts with another component, then you need to go to an application acceptance and integration because you won't have access to it here, and that's not where you should be testing it. This is for this component only.
Yeah.
So here's the spies. So I needed to know that, so here, let me pull up the file so you can see what the file itself is doing.
Why
All right.
did you have to do restore? Why would spine modify?
Spy will, I'll come back to it. Let me show you what the code's doing and then you can come back. So there's a count, let me pull up the template as well. That will also help. Templates.
So why would you have to restore?
Okay. So here's the template for the component. And it uses the count title computed property to set its title on the tooltip component, which when you mouse over, it gives you, the title up here. That's how it visually is rendering. So this count title comes, sets the title. So that count title property inside of the component is going to look at the data that's set on it externally. And if there's open tickets, if the value of the open tickets is greater than 0, then it's going to call this method, otherwise it's going to call that method. And then you get down into these methods, and they're going to call the translate service that's registered, because in the scope of the application, it needs to be able to look at these keys. Well, in a unit test, I don't want these things to fire. Like, it doesn't exist. From a component standpoint, only looking at the code, if I copy and paste this and drop it into some JavaScript file and try to run it, it's going to yell that this .translate is an undefined function. That comes from your application, not the unit under test. So what I had to do was I needed to get that out of the way. I needed to know that this method was being called, but without that method really being called, because otherwise it's going to fail and die on me. So what I did was, so up to this point we've just been saying this subject, right? Well, you can actually pass parameters to the subject when you're instantiating them, just like you would pass them in a template, like through the bindings. So I can say, I'm going to pass in a model property, and then I'm going to have this object on it. The reason why that's here, let me show you the other one just so you can understand the context in which that's running. It's a side effect of how we actually have our code set up. The templates, components. I know where it is. Dashboard. Okay. So this is a panel, don't get caught up on that. This is a separate panel of open tickets that we can drop on our dashboard and move it around. It's going to use this other component we're talking about, the dashboard open tickets button. There's going to be 4 of these buttons, 5 of these buttons, I can count. This one is going to be how many abuse tickets you have open. This one's how many account tickets you have open, sales tickets, support tickets, and other. And its data is set to the model property, and then it's getting it off of our actual open tickets model that we have. Like, because when you log in, our way our data structure works, like there's a bunch of nested data about your account. So we've extracted the abuse tickets off of this and set it as the model on the component. We've extracted this and set it as the model. Extracted this and set it as the model. So when I'm in my test, I'm emulating that structure here and saying, here's your model, here's your data. So that way it's got that same structure that it's expecting. I'm setting translate, I'm overriding translate. So when we're over here in one of these files, instead of having this translate file, or excuse me, this.translate, that's a property that's on this component because it's getting injected via initializers in the application. What I'm doing is saying, I want to override that translate to be a sit and spy. So now it exists as a method to be called. And once it has been called, now I can look at the methods and see how many times they were called or called once or those types of things. So I've taken a method that I don't want to be under test because I don't have the translate service available to me, but that translate service is in the code path. So I'm going to replace that with a spy so I can see that if it was called, then I know that that code executed correctly because it made a call over here. But it's going to call to something that's actually going to work, and it's something that I can spy on and react to. So I am spying on those methods, and then I can, again, see the execution. So it allows me to replace them with no-op code that I can then monitor. And so now it lets me follow that if I call account title and open tickets is greater than 0, then it's going to call this method. Conversely, it'll call this method if that value is not greater than 0. Because again, I'm testing all of the paths through my code. And so that's where I'm using the sit and spy as well. I'm also using it here, same idea. I've got my translate, because I want to make sure that when I call getOpenText, that method, getOpenText, it's actually going to call my translation service with this translation key. Because that translation key specifically belongs to this component. We don't use it anywhere else in our application. But again, I'm not going to do the translation. I just want to know that I have the right key being associated with the correct part of the logic. So I'm spying on this translate here. I'm spying on translate. I call getOpenText. It's then going to call translate, which is now being spied. It's going to pass these parameters into it. So now I can come out here and say, I want to find the arguments, and this is just syntax ascending, you don't have to worry about it. And it pulls it across. I want to grab the parameters object off of those arguments, and then this is where I turn them into object keys so I can flatten it out so I can say, is it equal to it for its length. But anyway, the idea is I was able to look inside this code and know that that key is actually being used by this method without actually ever having to call that actual function that does not exist at the moment that code's being tested. Because I'm testing that getOpenText is associated with this key.
I understand you're using spies that you can get some of those values, but why is this not stub and lump?
I didn't need it to be. SPY is the simplest of them, and it got me what I needed. You could do it with a stub and a mock. They just bring extra things to the table I didn't need. I didn't need a predetermined execution path of logic. I just needed to know that it was called and what it was called with. Any three of them would have worked here perfectly, equally well. SPY got me there, so.
How does SPY not actually call translate?
Because the translate is a property on this component, just like get open text and all these other ones are.
Oh, and translate on SPY?
And
is
so
a map of some sort?
I set translate to equal a sit and SPY object, or method, or however you want to refer to it. So now, when this component was created, when it was instantiated using this subject, it set the translate property equal to a sit and SPY. So when I call this method, which then calls this.translate, it's really calling this method instead, at which point it allows me to go ask it what its arguments were and pull my object keys off of it, which in this case were parameters, because I passed it both a key and a parameter. That's where that's coming from. Because this right here, when the code got executed, got replaced with a sit.spy. And so it lets me test in isolation, and that's the key to doing unit testing. I'm not testing other code. Other tests will test that code. I'm testing my code. And there's times in your code where your code relies on other code to be there, but you can't test like that, and so you need to isolate it. You could do it with mock stub. You don't even have to use synod. I could have just made my own object that had a method, and then when it got called, it would have returned something back. Like, I could wire my own op. I'd rather use a library that's consistent and well maintained.
This works because you don't get the result trace.
I could get the result. One of these has the result in it.
The result of translate?
Correct. Not the real translate. Pretty sure.
Yeah, at the bottom, trying to say that.
Well, in this case, I overrode what translate did. I wasn't using sit in here. I truly wanted to just return null, because what I was trying to do here is there's a class down here at the bottom. It's a computed property that watches the open tickets, and depending on how many tickets there are, it's going to either return the text string of warning or text. And so what I needed is, again, when I call, when I execute when I put the component, why did I have to do that?
If you want the result,
You know, I might not need that anymore. Because it's never rendering to the DOM, and since it's not rendering to the DOM, this line here is not being called, and it's this line right here that fires those other two that have a dependency on the translate. So that might have actually been a byproduct of my just writing code this afternoon and not paying attention. I might not need this. Because ultimately, I'm just checking that, hey, it comes back to this. Then if I set the open tickets value to this, because initially it was greater than 2, so I should get a warning. Then when I set it to 0 and I ask it, it should give me that success. Because again, I'm testing the output of the theme computed properly. Based on my input, am I getting back? Based on my temperature, am I getting back steam or ice or whatever? Like, this is exactly that type of scenario right here. So that's some of the things that you might, some approaches to how you can solve some of the things that you run into.
Could you go over some non-component?
Sure. Let's do, and these libraries, we're going to have a meeting this week. I never told you, Matt. I think we're going to just do a beta release on these things. Our hope is that we're going to speak at EmberConf about them, assuming they'll accept us. So we have to get them out the door in order to show it to them. Because call for papers ends in like 2 weeks or 3 weeks.
Oh, does it really?
Yeah, December 6th, I think, or 16th. I forget the exact math, but soon. All right, test. So this is a translation service. So we can look at, let's look at the actual, let me pull up the file so you can see what it does. Okay, so this is a translate service. So there is no services inside of Ember. There's eventually going to be. So it's just an object. We register it as a service. We hold on to it like that kind of thing. We just treat it as such, and we hope we're pretty close in alignment with whatever it does. And then we'll make any tweaks we need to down the road. But anyway, so this is just a plain old object, as you can see. It has a dictionary. This is just a lookup service. Basically, a method that will set the dictionary on that property. Then you can get a key value, and then you can also translate the key. It supports string replacement and pluralization and stuff like that. And so there's a bunch of code in here, blah, blah, blah. It's just a plain old object. So this is a unit test to test all of that. So this is just a module because there's no special helper. This is just an object. It's not a component. It's not a model or anything like that. So it's just a module, which is why I have to do my own setup, because it's not a helper that gives me some of that automatic creation that I need to do this myself. Now, I've had a bunch of these. Maybe I write my own helper, but I don't, so I just did it this way. So I'm setting up my translation service, which I'm importing from here. So that's how I got the code in order to test it. I pulled it in, I instantiated it. So then, you basically can see it, the dictionary property defaults to null, so I'm just going, testing that that's what's happening. Then I can, that set dictionary will set the data on the property. So I'm going to create a test dictionary, which is just a plain old object. I'm then setting the dictionary, and then I'm doing a deep equal that what I pull out of it is equal to what I just defined and passed in. And hey, look, now I know that my test dictionary method is working. I'll just kind of leave that up there as you're looking. You pretty much get the idea.
Could you go over like how to test, I guess, the controller logic?
Sure. Do I have a controller on this one? I don't know if we have a controller yet, although it's pretty much exactly like this, because it's standalone, like it's just an object. If you want to test that it's reacting to things from the DOM, and you can do more of an acceptance testing where you can say, fill this in, and then watch this. And so if it like sets a property that your controller should be watching as a computed property, returning a different value, and the DOM's updated, you can see it that way. Or same thing, you can just have the object, the controller actually under test, and then say, I'm going to set this property, and then I'm going to call this other one, and its value should not be this, because it should have reacted to it. Like it's as straightforward as literally what you just saw. There's nothing, like I said, the hardest part of testing is the components, because they blur some of those concepts. But as far as the rest of the stuff, testing, it's just plain old JavaScript. And then you put them all together by using the fill in, visit, click this button, and look at some stuff that came back. It's all the same pattern over and over. This is a functional integration test, even though it's in the functional folder. That is testing keyboard shortcuts. So I just want to show. So we visit the URL, which is really just the main application. It could be any route, because this actually gets injected across the entire application, but we have to pick one. So anyway, visit the main URL. I am stubbing out the actions method so I can see that they were actually called, because I don't want to trigger the actual actions that are going on. I just want to make sure that the key does it. And then I am simulating a question mark by doing a shift modifier on this key, and then I'm checking that that method was actually called the way I expect it to be. This library here, so we're using Mousetrap, which is a keyboard event library. So we're using Mousetrap to do all of our bindings, what I can show you. And I was like, how am I going to emulate all these things? Like, if you've ever done any sort of key event stuff, like they're a pain in the ass. They really are. Because some fire on key ups and some don't, and escape's weird most of the time, and different browsers, different things, character codes. Oh, it's a disaster. And then you've got foreign keyboards, and even that's are weird. Anyway, so this library is great because they handle all of that. And I'm like, well, how did they do their testing? Because that's how I'm going to do my testing. And I go in there, and I'm like, holy cow. They wrote a helper library for their code to test their code. Like, awesome. And so I import, because I'm already pulling in their library to use it. So when I'm not in production, I'm also pulling in their helper library, which is the key event. And then now I have access to it. And now I can call their simulate method that they have and it took care of all that stuff for me. And now I can do my modifiers and all that kind of stuff. And so now I was able to come in here and I can emulate, oh, they just pressed the escape key. Now I know that the key map escape function, or action rather, was actually called. And so this is the same thing over and over and over. But it was awesome because, like I said, I was able to go and use their library that they use to do their own testing, pull it into mine, and make use of it to emulate the same keystrokes. So I didn't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
And then I use functional testing to say, hey, go visit this URL, then run these things.
Do you have any examples of like overriding the container in a full functional startup method that you mentioned earlier?
Oh yeah, actually Matt did.
As I was thinking, like how to replace like an entire like an unknown component, like a receipt block. So if you're authenticating with Twitter or Facebook and you want to run this test as a command line, you can't have someone manually enter their user and password for Facebook using iframe. So you need to like somehow either create an access token.
Right. So is this a good example of that, Matt? Where you set the container on the store itself. But if not, the concept would be the same because you have this .container. So you can...
Yeah, what am I unit testing here? The store?
Yes.
Yeah, because I'm trying to just isolate the store, I just created a mock container on it because the store looks up models on a container. And like with Ember, when you create any object, it gets a container put on it. So I just mocked up a container. That's like the minimum you need for a container, those three functions and those two. That array in there.
So this code and the other code you've been seeing, it works. It does exactly what you want. There's no problems, blah, blah, blah. If you were to go ask any of the core team members and they put some mind space to it, they may very well have a better approach.
Yeah.
But go search. There are no better approaches presented in the community. That's why we want to get this code out here, so we can be like, hey, Robert Jackson and Stefan and anybody else, like, hey, look, at your leisure, this is how we approach this problem. And hopefully they'll be like, oh, hey, this would be a better way, that kind of thing. Like, there are libraries out there written in the latest and greatest Ember, and they don't have tests. You look at Discourse, which is probably Discourse, I always screwed that up, which is probably one of the earliest applications, and it's very full featured and whatnot, and it has tests, but they don't tackle this kind of stuff. Like, it's very hard to find examples of this. And so, again, this works. Because at the end of the day, it's just calling an object, and as long as you're mocking, stubbing, replacing, whatever, conceptually, I don't think that there's a more correct way. That being said, I can show you an example of something that smells really bad, but I know of no other way to accomplish it. I wasn't happy with that, but after about 20 minutes worth of work, I'm like, I'm going to have to be happy because I've got a lot more tests to write, and maybe if I just take a break, it'll come to me later. So back into that same component test, I wanted to make sure that my count title computed property was observing the correct properties. Because we had a problem when I was trying to run the code. It was set up. It wasn't watching the right properties. Because of the way they were setting that model, which is another sub-object, it needed to watch model.open tickets and model.unread tickets, not open tickets and unread tickets. That code was not working the way they thought it was working. And so I was like, hey, we should write a unit test to make sure that the correct properties are being observed. Because the next person who comes in who doesn't have a good enough understanding of Ember sees those and goes, what the hell, and takes them off, it's going to break. So I wanted to do that. So I go and get my component. Well, I have to append it to my view because computed properties don't actually get registered until they've been asked for because of the way they work with the initialization inside of Ember. So I need to go ahead and do the append in order to trigger all that stuff off, so I can do it manually. And then there is a hasObserver4 method inside of Ember, and I should be able to say component hasObserver4 model open tickets, and component hasObserver4 model unread. Open tickets was true, unread was false. I tried every possible combination of setting values, calling values, triggering observers, notify property changes, like everything, and I could not get it to consistently give me an answer. something tells me there's something weird about either the way I set the test up or the way the tests run in general. I don't know. I gave up, put the comment of to do, prefer to use has observers, couldn't get it working correctly. And instead, I'm doing a very, very, very ugly thing. I'm getting my component and I'm grabbing the Ember meta property. Notice all those underscores? That's Ember's way of saying stay the hell away from this stuff. It's a private API. They have threatened that if people use those too often, they will continue to add underscores until it is so painful for people to stop typing it. And then I grab the dependencies off of that, which is a gigantic object, and then I got the keys, turned that into an array, passed it into my in array, and then I say, hey, are the two computed properties I'm looking for on this thing? Because this is the list of things you're watching. And then it tells me pass or fail. This works, but that is fugly. It's those kinds of things where it's like, I couldn't find an answer in the community. I want to wrap this up, write a quick little post, throw it on a gist, and I throw it out in the Ember community and be like, hey, how would you do this?
Yeah. So has observer for, so you were saying that the test was flaky?
Yeah.
Okay. So that makes me think like it's a async issue. So
Quite
you're appending
possibly.
something, you're appending a component to the DOM. So maybe there's something there that's like.
So yeah, that's a good idea. I could try. I never tried playing with any of the async stuff. Like yeah, if I threw that in a rock loop or something, that's a good idea. Yeah, I could give that a try.
I'm very new to all of this.
No, that's perfectly fine. I mean, I didn't go down that path at all. Like I said, I spent about 20 minutes not on that path. And I finally said, I do know how to get this. It's not the right way, but watch this.
Probably get an idea of our deadlines because it's like,
Yeah.
I spent 20 minutes on this, 30 minutes on that.
Let me show you one other quick pattern since we're in here, and then that's pretty much it. I mean, we keep talking, but that's pretty much it. No, I want to be in here. How you get mix-ins. This one is a correct pattern. Correct as in it doesn't feel wrong, but again, if somebody has a better way. So I want to make sure that my component has a particular, again, it doesn't have to be a component, it could be anything. It's just, I've been writing component unit test. So that's what I have the most examples of. But if I want to see if, so this tooltip, SL tooltip, it needs to have the tooltip enabled mixin. It uses that. So I'm going to pull in my tooltip enabled mixin, import it, and then I have a test, and this is literally the only test because it extends and then it does everything else down there. You can do a detect on a mixin. So basically it says, hey, detect if you can find yourself on the object you're expecting to find yourself on. So just like you have the has observer for that I was expecting to work correctly, there is a detect as well on mixins. And so this is how you can, this does work correctly and consistently. Like this is how you can make sure that you have the right mixins. Because again, that's important to a unit test. Like what makes up this component or a controller or whatever, like there are things I'm expecting to be there. And so this is how you can tell.
So it's detecting the presence of the mixin in the component?
Correct.
Okay. All right.
Yep. Yeah, because this
So
stuff
it's
is
like
subject.
flipped around.
I know, the detect is, I screw it up every time. Because you would expect it to say, I want to detect this on me. Instead it says, you're the mixin,
Detect
detect if
me
you're on there.
you.
Yeah, I agree, it's a weird syntax. Every time I screw it up. But correct, that's what that's doing. It's detecting the tooltip enabled mixin on the SL tooltip component. And actually, this should say is not present, because this will be the message that's shown if OK fails. So I really should make that a negative tense, not present tense. But either way, 99% is getting that right.
No, you got that right.
No, because if OK fails, I want this to be the error message. It should say expected mixin is not present.
Yeah, don't look at my error messages because I do it fast.
But you'd see the expected mixin is present, red. So that means not.
Well, yeah, that's true. I guess it depends on how you.
like, I'm
Ah!
so like I'm coming from Ruby, so everything's positive facing.
Yeah, you're right.
And then
Yeah, we need
if
to
they're
pick a
negative,
vernacular and
it's-
stick with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. We need style guides for our unit tests. We're not style guides. We need a vocabulary guide for our unit tests. You're right. Yeah, you're correct. Yes.